Hey folks, John here. So I was recently rewatching a Q&A session that Roaming Millennial did a few months ago at Lafayette University, attempting to explain Trump to a group of radical left-wing students. The comedy, it just writes itself. Overall, I'm really impressed at how well she handled herself in front of what turned out to be a pretty volatile audience. It was evident that despite the fact that the students were heavily invested on an emotional level, most of them had actually put very little thought into their worldview, and she pretty much schooled them. Most of the issues brought up by the crowd were actually pretty asinine, and Roaming knocked them down admirably. Anyways, I wasn't that happy with everything that Roaming had to say at Lafayette, and while she managed to school the students, they're a bunch of overgrown children, and I'm old enough to be her quintuple great-granddaddy. So let's see if we can get to the bottom of this.
And as someone who is a raging individualist, I don't like the idea of my viewpoints being attributed to people who are not me, regardless of the fact that we may share the same skin color or religion or orientation. And I also don't like the idea of being considered either an oppressor or oppressed, depending on the situation, again, based on those same metrics, which have nothing to do with my individual stance or situation. I just want to say that this divide, this cultural divide, it's not really between the left and the right. I'd say at least a good 30 to 40% of people who support me are actually on the left themselves. I would say it's a more collectivist versus individualist sort of thing.
Let's examine this claim. With individualism and collectivism, we have two ideologies in direct conflict with each other, and understanding this is actually pretty simple. But with the two wings of politics, things become a bit more complicated. With left and right, you're looking at a conflict in actual fact between two groups of people. And yeah, the people in each group are loosely aligned with each other over belief, but that's only one factor at play. If we shift outside our bubble of political YouTube and look at the average Joe, most people don't really think about individualism or collectivism or really any otherism. If they've even heard of these things, let's be honest, they're probably too busy doing something useful with their lives. But what they do know, in the context of America at least, is whether they vote Team Democrat or Team Republican. So what impact does party affiliation actually have?
But for many people, it was a choice that corresponded with their party identification. He got 90% of the Republican vote, I got 90% of the Democratic vote.
Now, you could just say that she's making up excuses, and you'd be right, but whatever. Even if our lobotomized masses are not across the individualist-collectivist debate, that doesn't make the debate culturally unimportant. Committed ideologues do care about this stuff. They're highly motivated and not above playing dirty. All they need to do is to perform their long, slow, hostile takeover of the institutions, and presto changeo, they've got disproportionate power to support their agenda. Once they're there, no need to worry themselves with such trivialities as a democratic process or whether or not anyone else actually wants what they're pushing. They know what's best for society, and who are you to contradict them? So when they raise the collective up against all else and they devalue the individual, and at that point they begin to disassociate their cherished collective from the actual people who supposedly make it up. In extreme cases, the devaluation of human life is not far behind. Just look at Soviet Russia. It oppressed its own workforce in the name of liberating the workers, because somehow that makes sense. No. Allow collectivism to run amok and we're all off on our merry little way to mass political purges and concentration camps.
How fun!
Yeah. So, I think it's safe to say we need to advocate for a healthy amount of individualism in our society. But how much? Should we all be raging individualists like Roaming Millennial? Well, to work that out rationally, we first need to be honest with ourselves about what our stance actually is, if our ideology is consistent, and if not, should it be? So with all that out of the way, let's have a look at Roaming's stance and see if we can spot a problem.
If someone was transgender, if they passed the test to be able to be in the military and were mentally stable, so they did not have a mental health issue, being in war would not pull them into something that would impact their ability to serve. Do you believe that person should be allowed to serve in the military, yes or no?
No.
This doesn't sound very much like we're judging people as individuals now, does it? Surely we should be judging each candidate based on their merit and not based on their membership of a collective group. I mean, that's what individualists think, right? I mean, just 10 minutes ago you were saying this.
Being an individualist means that you want to treat people based on their own personal character and merit and be treated in turn on your own personal character and merit.
Well, look, I'm not being completely fair here. Let's go back a bit and get a bit more context on her position.
I just want to bring up the transgender ban, about the military ban, and that's a direct example of how Trump actually is against the LGBTQ community, because the T is a part of that. He is saying that transgender people shouldn't be allowed to serve in the military, and I know you're probably about to cite some Fox News statistics about how transgender people, they are taking up resources.
Just to start off with, it doesn't come up much, but we should separate out the question of trans in the military from the question of whether or not the military and therefore the taxpayer should actually have to pay for the transition surgery. The answer to the second question is obviously a hard no.
Not allow transgender people into the military from no fact other than the fact that they're transgender is in and of itself against the LGBTQ community by Trump. So,
Do you think President Trump is anti-flat-footed people?
I know what your point is trying to say, that people who are flat-footed also aren't able to be in the military, and that was a way to get into that point. But there's a difference, because if someone is able-bodied and is able to pass the test to get into the military, and the only thing other is that the fact that they want to transition, then that should not be able to impact whether or not they're able to serve this country.
As someone who has been diagnosed with anxiety, I actually am also disqualified from military service.
Okay. But these things impact the combat effectiveness of each individual applying for the role. I don't know that firing a gun is somehow less deadly just because the person firing it has cut off their own junk.
I have a lot of friends in the military, and I think there's a real issue there with mental health in the military. The suicide rates of service members and PTSD rates are unbelievably high.
I'm not actually gonna let you finish, because I think that the way you talk, you implement a lot of fallacies, so you're going around in circles right now, and that's
none of this was a fallacy.
No, you are, because you're
what hasn't been true.
Yes, Roaming isn't using circular logic here, and I don't know what this woman is talking about. Next.
You went straight to mental illness. You went straight to having issues with our mental health, and no one is saying that mentally ill transgender people should be able to go.
Transgenderism is still a medical diagnosis. It's still a mental diagnosis.
Yeah, but is it a diagnosis that impacts their ability to serve in all cases? Arguably, the answer is no.
And the suicide rates of transgender individuals, or attempted suicide rates of transgender individuals, around 40%. I don't want to put at-risk populations into situations where they are further at risk. The suicide rate among service members is already way too high. If anything, we need to be stricter to ensure that this doesn't happen.
Oh, so they're an at-risk population. You mean that you think we should judge individual candidates not based on their merits, but based on attributes of their collective group. If an individual transgender wants to serve in the military, is completely stable emotionally, and has no greater risk of suicide than the average person, well, screw them, because their collective group is at risk. This argument is no different than the argument for affirmative action. This person is in an at-risk group, so they shouldn't get the job. That person is in a marginalized group, so they should get the job. The only difference here is the side of politics that it comes from. So what were you saying about the left-right divide being less important?
Well, there's an issue with your question. You mentioned if there was a transgender individual who didn't have any mental issues. Transgenderism is a mental issue. It's an issue that causes people a lot of distress. It's not something. It's a serious issue that requires counseling, medication, and surgery.
Yes, but it's a distress that a person can overcome, and adversity can actually make people stronger. We don't know at what point each person is at in their psychology because we have not assessed them all individually. We just lump them all in together and go with the mean.
And the thing is that there are tons of people with anxiety who would be able to serve in the military perfectly, but it is still an at-risk population. And when we're talking about the military doesn't care about our feelings. It's not a place for feelings. They care about statistics and averages. That's why there are average, physical measures that you have to meet. You have to, if you weigh at least this much, you have to, be at least this tall. These kind of things. It's a systematic thing where they're trying to recruit the best that they can based on these metrics. And people who are at risk, especially for suicide, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't make sense to put them in those situations. And that's not to say that every transgender individual wouldn't be capable of being a soldier. It's just, should the military take that chance and put at-risk populations into further at-risk situations based on the statistics? I would say no.
So should the metrics be based on the individual's attributes or of their collective identity? What if a trans person happens to be the best of the best? Screw them, right? The facts don't care about our feelings, and if the facts show that the individual is the best person for the job, well, we should just completely ignore that. Oh, and yeah, individualism totally isn't a buzzword that we can just forget about whenever it's inconvenient to our side of politics.
I know that you guys care about this issue, and you're trying to implement what you see is a fair society. And I get that. And because transgender individuals who may or may not, we can't know for sure, be able to serve in the military are being banned just on the basis of being transgender, you don't think that's fair?
And if you were to put your individualist hat on, then neither would you. Look, I'm not here as some sort of individualist Puritan. Whether you consciously thought this through or not, it's obvious that you think that the application of individualism or collectivism should actually be contextual. And I agree. I just think that we need to be self-aware about this. The individualist and collectivist mindsets exist in human beings for a reason, and there's circumstances where collective action is legitimately the best or the only approach to addressing an issue. Without some version of collective psychology, humans wouldn't be able to cooperate anywhere nearly as effectively as we do, and the military is actually a great example of this, for better or worse. So how do we navigate this? When do we want collectivism? Well, that's a very hard question to answer, but it sure as hell isn't when judging individual job applicants. In that scenario, it is completely practical to assess each person on their merits, and individual judgments should apply regardless of their identity, and yes, including when judging trans people. If you don't agree with that, then please, don't tell me that you're an individualist.